Alright guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to finally bring it together with the imperfectly competitive labor market. We have our demand curve, our supply curve, we have our marginal factor cost of labor curve. Bring it all home together, one nice and neat video. Alright, so again, quick recap. We have our downward sloping demand curve, which is equal to the marginal revenue product of labor in imperfect competition, because we find out what that additional units of output that the last worker was able to produce. We multiply that by the marginal revenue that the company, the firm, gets or earns as a result of that. So additional worker produced 10 additional units. Those units each sell for $3. $3 times 10 is $30. That is the marginal revenue product of labor. It's downward sloping because of diminishing marginal returns. Okay, supply curve, upward sloping. They are facing the labor market supply and they have sufficient market power. They are large enough that when they demand more labor, if this demand curve shifted to the right, for instance, they would have to pay higher wages. Because they face the upward sloping supply curve, they have to pay higher wages, but it's not just to the last worker, it's going to be to all of their workers. You're going to have to charge or pay them a higher wage rate, which is going to lead to the marginal factor cost of labor, or the cost of employing one additional unit of labor, MFCL, is greater than the wage rate for a imperfectly competitive firm or a monopsonist. If it's that's the labor market version of a monopolist. Monopolist is where there's one seller of a good. Monopsonist is when there's one buyer of a good. In this case, the good is labor. So we call them a monopsonist in this instance. So this is what it would look like for a monopsonist or any imperfectly competitive labor market firm. All right. Now, the question that we need to ask are two things. One, how much labor should this firm buy? How much should they employ? For the perfect competitive firm, that was easy. There was just two curves on there, and so it was where the downward sloping demand curve intersected the horizontal supply curve, and boom, that's the quantity of labor that they should employ. Super easy. This one we have these two curves, and so this one becomes a little trickier potentially, but it's not bad, I promise. So, here's your hint. How do firms know how much to produce? Produce to the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, right? If we look here, you gotta look a little carefully and closely, but we can find a version of marginal revenue and marginal cost. So this is the same principle. Again, I promise, you've already learned all this stuff, you can do this. MRPL, the first two words, marginal revenue, product of labor. So we know we need it to be equal to MR, but there's only one downward sloping curve, so maybe that doesn't help too much. But we want marginal revenue to equal marginal cost. And there is a letter in between, but we see marginal and cost, the marginal factor cost of labor. So this is representing our marginal cost of employing one more factor. In this case, that factor is labor. So the way that this imperfectly competitive firm will find their quantity of labor that they need to purchase is going to be where marginal factor cost of labor is equal to the marginal revenue product of labor. So that is going to occur at that intersection of MFCL. Oops, let me not do that. Sorry. I'm jumping ahead of myself. See what happens when you don't think? You just start to do things automatically. So let's just do that right now. So all we know from that information, try to erase this, pretend like there's no history of it. All we know now is that that is the quantity at which they should produce. However, just like the monopolist competition, and oligopolist, when we find that MR equals MC, is that the price that they charge? No. They move up to their demand curve, right? So if I draw that again, this is just for your reference, so you see this is the mirror image of that other concept. So we have our MC curve, we have our MR curve, and our demand curve, right? MR, MC. So they find their quantity right there where MC equals MR, but that's not the price they charge. They go up to the demand curve, and that tells us how much people are willing to pay for this quantity. So for them, that quantity is there. The price, though, they get to charge a higher price. That's part of that market power thing. They get to charge a price that is greater than marginal revenue. Well, guess what? Something similar is going to happen here in the labor market. For this quantity of labor, it turns out they don't need to pay that higher wage. What they need to do is now come down from this quantity of labor, and they need to find where does it intersect the supply curve. And it's going to intersect the supply curve down here, much lower. And so that is going to be the wage that they are going to actually pay. So they have some power here. They are not going to pay up here where their decision is made. They make their decision of how much labor to buy based on when the marginal factor cost of labor equals the marginal revenue product of labor. However, they don't pay that wage. They pay the lower wage where the supply curve intersects with this quantity. So it's again same as before when we did it down here, just kind of a mirror image sort of a thing. So we find our quantity by the intersection of MFCL and MRPL, and then using that quantity we find how much labor are people willing to sell and supply for that, or how much. When we ask for this quantity of labor to be supplied, how much do we need to pay it? And the answer is just wage star down here. So they get this difference. They don't have to pay. So that wage is lower. Just like we said, the wage is less than that marginal factor cost of labor. All right. Hopefully that's not too bad. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. And you know what? On the AP test, I actually went through and I looked back at like 7 AP exams. This is the question they ask about this market. So if you're freaking about this market, don't. What you need to know is they're going to ask you one of two things. They're going to ask, what's the quantity? Quantity is when MFCL equals MRPL. Or they're going to ask you, what's the wage rate? And the wage rate is when you find that quantity, where does it intersect the supply curve? Those are the only two questions I have ever seen them ask about this model. That's it. Okay? So I hope this helps. Till next time, this has been a LaMoney production.